Good evening. There's a joke someplace about a lawyer following holiday lights, but I'm not sure what it is. So, several months ago, in speaking with Chairman Van Duzen and Mr. Norris, they thought it would be a good idea if, at the beginning of the planning process, I could provide an overview of the agency. So what I'm going to do tonight is talk about several different things. First, I'm going to start describing the agency, the history of the agency, providing a brief timeline for you to refresh your recollection for those of you who have been here through the since the beginning, and for those who are new, provide perhaps some useful history. Then I will talk about some of the legal powers that the agency has and the constraints under which it must operate. And finally, from my own perspective, based on my experience with the agency, I'll just offer a few considerations that you might well keep in mind as you begin the planning process over the next several months. The agency began in the mid-'80s when a number of members of the Northwest Municipal Conference became aware of the fact that the entire landfill and garbage collection business was undergoing dramatic change from multiple landfills with many small operators to a gradually consolidating industry and closing landfills because of environmental regulations and just the economics. It was putting much pressure on the industry, and as a result, prices were becoming highly variable for the municipalities. And this became a topic of conversation among members of the agency, and they, I think, met for a couple of years to think about what could they do about it. Based on their experience in creating, I think, some members, there were 3 separate water agencies created in the early '80s to provide Lake Michigan water for northern, western, and DuPage County municipalities. So the conference members thought what we need to do is to follow those kinds of analogs and create a separate intergovernmental organization that will help us collectively resolve the issues that we face in the garbage services business. So a statute was written. Actually, my beginning with the agency goes all the way back to a donut shop in Northbrook sometime, I think, in 1986. When I met with Bill Grams first to talk about the idea that he and the conference were pursuing, led to the drafting of a statute which was passed in 1987 that closely paralleled the authorization in the Intergovernmental Cooperation Act to create water agencies, JAWA being the best example. And that was passed, and we immediately began the process of negotiating among up to 32, as I recall, individual towns ranging from Glencoe on the northeast all the way down to Streamwood, I think, on the southwest. Finally, after about a year of back and forth, a contract was drafted, and it was executed by the members, 28 at the time, and the agency was created. The original plan of the agency very much focused on a governmental solution to the solid waste crisis, as it was described at the time. By that I mean government would be the principal actor. It would pursue and build its own facilities, and it would provide the services directly to the members and their residents. So in 1988, just a few dates, in 1988, 28 members created the agency by contract. Between the period 1988 and 1992, there were a series of very small bond issues that were offered to raise capital to pursue the planning process. The idea of a municipally owned landfill was in the original plan. A site was located out in the far corners of Cook County, where it butted up against Kane and DuPage counties on an old abandoned strip mine. And we began the long and what turned out to be, to all of our dismay, an extremely long process to try to permit the bale, what as became known as the bale fill. Simultaneously, there was a fair amount of planning done on exactly what is the waste system we're going to deal with. The idea of creating multiple transfer stations, baling waste, bringing it to the bale fill, the baling thought to extend the useful life of what would be an important asset was in part of the original plan. The first transfer station was located in River Road, just across the Des Plaines River from the closed Sexton landfill, and permitting for that particular facility began. In 1992, it was clear we needed to raise money to build the bale fill. I'm sorry, to build the transfer station, and we were still in the midst of attempting to permit the bale fill, and there were extensive expenses associated with that. So $55 million in debt was issued. In order to develop an adequate for security for that project, there was a long and difficult negotiation among all the members to develop a financing mechanism which led to what's known as the project use agreement that I'll speak about later in more detail. That project use agreement is a contract between the agency and each of the 28 members, now 23, and I'll come back to that in a minute, which serves in which the agency promises to produce a system and the members promise to send their garbage to the agency to provide for its disposition. That contract was entered into in 1992. Each of you is a party to that contract. The money was raised, the transfer station was built, and it opened in 1994 and has been accepting waste since that time. In 1994, the agency entered into its first contract with Groot to operate that facility on behalf of the agency and its members. As I indicated, nothing happened without controversy. I think every single initiative that the agency undertook was the subject of litigation. Some of it extraordinary in terms of its intensity, all of it long, and most of it expensive. I think most of you are familiar with the saga of the bale fill. The agency was able to get its zoning and its EPA permits for the site. The site was found to be safe. The Army Corps of Engineers determined that they had jurisdiction over the particular piece of property because migratory birds landed in the occasional waters created by the depressions from the old strip mining operation, and therefore interstate commerce was affected by the presence of the birds, and they denied the permit. The agency took the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and in 2001, the first case decided after Bush versus Gore was the agency's case in which the court ruled that the Army's attempt to exercise jurisdiction over waters of the United States, over the occasionally filled waters, was not within their statutory authority. Interestingly, just as an aside, some of the arguments that you see in the Obama health care argument about the extent of the Commerce Clause power of the federal government were present in the bale fill case that we brought. We chose not to pursue the constitutional arguments. Rather, we pursued before the court, because we thought they were the better arguments and less controversial, the argument that Congress had simply not authorized the Corps to deal with waters that had such inconsequential connections to traditionally interstate waters. However, when the court overruled the Corps, the state of Illinois determined that it was going to make us start over again with respect to our environmental permits. I think the environmental permits were about 10 years old at the time. Law was passed which said any permit for a landfill that has not been opened, that is 10 years old, you need to start over again. The permit is stale. Things like this were happening not because of any objective view on the merits, but because there was significant political opposition to the bail fill from DuPage County, Kane County legislators, and from their members in Congress who were involved in all kinds of legislative activity, both for and against us. Sure.
Is a bail fill the same thing as a landfill?
No, well, they both serve the same function. A landfill is the garbage is put in loose. It goes in the back of a trailer, you drive it out there, you dump it in the landfill, and you tamp it down, and then you put dirt on top of it. The bail fill was a process in which the garbage was dumped on the floor of the transfer station. It was then compacted into very tight individual units, much like a trailer on a flat car, essentially. And then it would be carted out to the landfill, and they would be stacked in rows and covered. And it resulted in a more efficient use of the space, but it introduced significant costs at the transfer station, which Steve Schilling, I think, can talk about in more detail. People are interested in that. So in any event, in 2002, the agency decided, you know what, we're not going to pursue this bail fill. It will take us through another endless round of litigation. While the members were loyal in their political support for it, there was simply too much opposition. And the decision was made to abandon the bail fill project and to rely on the private sector to provide the disposal space for the agency's waste. So the agency then embarked on a process of disposing of the excess real estate it had, and was able to do that by selling the bail fill, large portions of the bail fill site to the state of Illinois for a park, a state park. The main opposition to the bail fill had used an argument that it was a natural habitat for a bird whose southernmost reach is Cook County, and that it was an important habitat for that bird, and therefore this was a violation of the federal law to face that environment. So we sold the land to the state of Illinois. Land was also, the balance of the land that had not been strip mined was sold to a home builder. The agency abandoned the cost, received in excess of $20 million for the various assets that it had, and retired debt, most of the debt associated with the bail fill development process. Importantly, I think at what happened at that time was that there was a change in the planning that the agency, in the direction of the planning that the agency was pursuing, from a totally government-owned and operated facility into a process in which the agency would rely on the economic influence it had because it controlled the waste for roughly 800,000 people, and could either pursue on its own or in concert with the private sector efficient delivery and disposal methods for the waste it controlled. So quickly going from the timeline from 2000 into the present, because the agency had been embarked on this very substantial capital-intensive process, there was extensive planning effort as to how do we reduce the costs to the members associated with the operations of the agency. Obviously, disposing of unnecessary assets, real estate was the first attempt. In addition to the sale of the Balefield land, some excess land that was held by the agency as part of the transfer station site was also disposed of. And there was an effort to reduce tipping fees to the members in a variety of different ways. The first thing that was done was the balers were removed from the transfer station. We went to a loose waste operation, which not only and we received some value for the balers when they were sold, but we also significantly reduced the electrical costs to operate the Balefield. We purchased electricity in the marketplace rather than through Edison, something that many of you are doing these days. The GROOT contract was renegotiated in 2007 to reduce the costs associated with that, and a variety of changes were made in the debt that the agency had issued in order to reduce the debt service cost as interest rates had declined since the 1992 debt was sold. So this is a chart that you've seen before. It was in the annual report, but it illustrates, if you look at 2002, you see the total cost to the members in the vicinity of $70 a ton, a significant portion of that being the debt, and the operating cost at $44. You see the changes over the years. The debt cost has been significantly reduced. There's only roughly $5 of debt cost per ton to the members associated with the project at this point. And the operating costs have been managed through the various changes in the operations at the transfer station and renegotiations of the GROOT contract that I identified. So that's a very quick summary of the history of the agency. Those of us who've been with it since the beginning would be delighted, I think, to tell war stories associated with much of this, but we'll do that at a different time. Let me turn to just try to provide a legal framework for you as you consider the various possible directions for the agency going forward. The agency is a creature of state law. There is a separate section of the statutes identified in the handouts, which is the authorizing legislation for the agency. And it is also a creature of contract among the now 23 members. Just an aside, there were 28 members originally when the agency was founded. 5 members chose not to sign the project use agreement in 1992 and withdrew from the agency at that time. The agency is a separate legal person. It is not its members. The members are not partners of the agency. It's not a joint venture of the members. It's a separate legal corporation, distinct from its members, and it has, like other legal entities, has a perpetual existence until it's dissolved. Yes.
Why is that? Why was thinking initially, and has that changed over time as other agencies such as this have been created?
I think that is true of most legal entities that are created by state law until the legislature dissolves them or the members who are part of them dissolve them. They maintain their existence. As you will see, the life that the agency was thinking of for its project was quite long, and so the notion of putting a fixed termination date in the contract or in the state statute didn't seem sensible at the time. Yes, sir.
Is there a common reason what 5 communities decided to drop, or separate reasons?
I think it's probably fair to say there were separate reasons associated with each one. My recollection is it was Streamwood, Schaumburg may never have joined, Streamwood, Roselle, Northfield, Northbrook, and one other that's in my notes. Des Plaines, right. And you can imagine where the transfer station is located, you can imagine why different people at different times decided they didn't want to have anything to do with the agency. Actually, can I ask you to hold your questions? I'll try to move through this, and then I'd be delighted to go through them at the end. The next slide shows the statutory purpose for the agency. There are a couple of things I wanted to emphasize in that. The first is that this provides some direction for what the agency is to do, and it also serves as a limit on what you cannot do. The agency is not a general purpose government like a municipality. It is certainly not a home rule entity. The only thing it can do is to deal with the topics listed in this particular definition and those that are necessarily related to that description. This limitation is found both in state law and in the agency agreement. Now, that's not to say that if 23 of the members decided that it would be good for you to do X, that could not be changed. The difficulty of making the change is you would have to go to Springfield, you'd have to amend the statute to expand the mission of the agency, and then you'd have to have an agreement among all the members to accomplish that purpose. So possible, perhaps impractical. In any event, my own view is there's plenty to do within the limitations of this particular definition. Second point is the term municipal waste. This is a term of art. The term is used in the Environmental Protection Act, and it focused the attention of the agency on a specific aspect of the waste stream. You're not in the business of dealing with industrial waste and things like that. There are a listing of functions associated with waste: transportation, collection, transfer, processing, treatment, storage, disposal, recovery, and reuse. That's relatively broad. The agency currently is only involved in a few of those particular aspects of its potential mission. So I think as you look at this, you can examine the purpose of the agency and decide whether your own interests and the market would suggest that you add to, modify, change in some fashion the nature of the services that you're providing based on the limitations contained in this particular section. The agency agreement does have provisions that permit the addition of additional members. However, there are serious obstacles to new members joining the agency. They were put in at the beginning because, if you recall, in 1988 we were attempting to put together an agency. There were a number of communities that were considering joining but not certain. And the people who decided they wanted to join thought it was important that if they were prepared to step up and take the risk for this adventure, that there not be a free ride for people who lay back and then, after all the heavy lifting is done, join the agency or seek to join the agency. So in order to join the agency, a majority of this board needs to approve the new member. Not only that, a majority of the members' boards, meaning each of the towns, has to approve the admission of a new member. Perhaps a significant economic deterrent is that the new member needs to pay an admission fee, if you will, of $15 per capita. And then the agency also has the power under the agreement to impose other conditions on the admission of that new member. So while this is an area that deserves examination because the transfer station is not utilized to its capacity, there are limitations, there are obstacles to adding additional members that you may want to discuss. Again, these can be changed. But to change them because they're in the contract, every single one of you needs to agree to those changes. The agency is governed by two different entities, or two boards, the Board of Directors and the Executive Committee. The founders, I refer to them, of the agency did have experience with similar organizations and thought it was important to have a combination of elected officials and top-level managers of governments in the organization, running the organization, and attempted to make a distinction between policy-level decisions, particularly among an agency that has 23 members, being vested in the Board of Directors, and the day-to-day decisions being vested in an executive committee. The executive committee, again, because of the complexity of assembling 23 members, the executive committee was delegated the ability to do virtually everything with defined exceptions. So if you look into the agency agreement, there are specific powers that are reserved to the members, to the Board of Directors. All other activities can be taken by the Executive Committee. Those powers are to adopt a budget, to admit new members, to put in, to enact or to authorize the execution of a project use agreement, to impose fees on the members, or to issue debt. Those, in fact, are the most significant powers that the agency has under law, and the agency requires board approval in order to pursue any of them. The agency also has a series of more typical powers that are contained both in state law and in the agency agreement. Importantly, the agency has no power to tax. It can only raise funds in two ways. The first is to charge people who use its project for the use of that project, and those people can either be customers or members, or to allocate the cost among its members, the towns, on a basis other than usage. If you remember, I indicated in the early days of the agency, it imposed charges on a per capita basis to finance the startup planning costs for the agency. Now the bulk of the agency's costs are imposed on the basis of usage of the agency transfer station. Importantly, any action the agency takes to impose charges must be taken by a 3/4 vote of the directors. So there must be significant agreement among the 23 members that this is a step to be taken. Historically, the funding, as I indicated, the initial funding was raised on a per capita basis. In 1992, the project use agreement was put in place, and has served as the financial underpinnings of the agency since that time. Let me talk a little bit about the project use agreement. The agency needed to raise a significant sum of money, and working with investment bankers, financial advisors, and the lawyers and the members of the executive committee, there were 4 challenges that had to be overcome in order to raise this kind of money. The first was, how are the bonds going to get repaid, and what assurance does an investor have that his investment is going to be repaid with interest over time? The second is, okay, they're building themselves a landfill. What happens if it doesn't get built? That's known as the black hole risk. The third would be, there's 23 members. What happens if one of them goes bad and they're sharing the costs? Are the others going to pick up that member's share? The fourth I'll come back to. How is the investor assured that the agency is going to be able to pay its debt? The way is, it's essentially a traditional revenue bond financing, just like a water bond. The members have access to garbage either by collecting it or hiring a hauler to collect it. They can charge for that service. They can promise to send their garbage to the agency, and they can promise that they will pay the agency for that service, and they will impose on the residents from whom they pick up their garbage fees sufficient to pay the costs of the agency's project. So control over the waste is an important underpinning to the financial structure that the agency operates under. Because there was a significant risk associated with the project, indeed the bail was never finished, it was important to provide the investors with assurance that they would be paid whether or not the project would be completed. There was no way the bond market was going to take project risk associated with particularly a solid waste project in this, or I suspect any climate, or in that, or in even today. So both state law and the project use agreement made clear that the members agreed to pay even if the project went belly up on day one. So there is a very stringent take-or-pay obligation in the agency agreement, which fortunately has never been tested, because while the bail field did not work, the agency was able to build and operate its transfer station and has been providing service to the members, and so the members have been paying the costs of the project that the agency undertook. The third challenge was the weak link in the financing, the one or two towns that might be having a bad stretch, and if they default, what happens to their obligation? The bondholder is going to have to chase that bad member. And the answer was no. Each member agreed to a deficiency charge, which was they would pay an amount equal to an additional 1/3 above their otherwise obligation if there were a deficiency. So there was a sharing of the risk of a defaulting member among the remaining members up to 1/3 of the individual obligation of any single member. Finally, and importantly, I think at the time 16 of the members were home rule communities. Many of them thought that that they would prefer that their charges be paid from taxes rather than on a revenue base. From the agency's perspective, the members promised to pay as a general obligation of that member rather than as a revenue obligation of that member, given the credit rating of those towns was seen as a significant advantage to the agency's credit. And so the home rule communities agreed that their obligations under the project use agreement would be a general obligation. Would be a general obligation. I believe it's actually their step-up obligation would be a general obligation. A couple of other things which are important going forward. The 3-year rolling average that has been a source of some aggravation in terms of planning, because in this down cycle, the budget is based upon your waste deliveries over the prior 3 years. And as in the economic down cycle, people generate less waste. So you're paying, assuming you're going to end up sending more tons than you ultimately do, was an attempt to even out those things rather than have up and down based upon annual averages. So that was put into the project use agreement. It's not magical, but again, it would take an amendment of the agreement for all the members to change it. One other thing that came out of actually the bond documents was an obligation that the agency set aside 2 months operating costs as a reserve. And so you will see on the financial statements an O&M reserve number, which is present because of the agency's covenants with its bondholders. When the bonds are retired, one could consider whether that is appropriate to continue. My own sense is that it is, because you need it for your own benefit, so that there is money on hand to deal with the fluctuations that naturally occur in the operating of any system like the transfer station. Talk just a little bit about the point I made earlier, the control of the waste being essential to the credit of the agency, and in fact the strength of the agency and its ability to deliver services to its members. It provides the essential security to the capital markets, knowing that the members have access to waste, that they provide services to people, that people are limited in their ability to find alternatives, and that the members can charge their residents for that service. That revenue stream and the services that the members in the agency provide in exchange is the essential economic underpinning associated with the credit, and I think it's also the essential economic strength that you collectively have and is important to focus on as you think about the kinds of things that you can do going forward. Your ability to do that is protected by state law. State law clearly authorizes municipalities to provide exclusive franchises or to control the collection of solid waste and to prohibit people from leaving in the alley, tossing it out the window, or other things. It is exempt from federal antitrust laws. I will say that during the time that the agency was engaged in much of its activity, the private waste haulers were seriously challenging municipal waste regulation and waste control as a violation of the Federal Commerce Clause. There were 2 United States Supreme Court cases, both decided by a 5-4 vote. One decided against a town in which there was a private operator that the agency, that the government body was directing all of the waste to be sent to. The second decided 5-4 in favor of the government body, in which the waste facility was owned by the government body. The law is at best unsettled in this area. I think it's important for you, as you enter into deciding what you're going to do, to think about the impact of your activities on the private sector and understand the competitive environment in which you're working, because the waste industry is not averse to using either the federal antitrust laws or the Commerce Clause to attempt to protect what they see as their own economic interests. Just a little detail on how you control the waste. Each of you has adopted what we gave the wonderful moniker of Financing Member Waste System Ordinance, in which you defined the geographic territories from which you promised you would collect or cause the collection of waste, and the types of waste that you would collect and deliver to the agency. My guess is those were all adopted in 1992. They may have been changed since that time, but it's worth you understanding in your town what it is that you've done. It's conceivable that it can, in fact, be expanded, and this is something that the agency probably ought to think about, and each member ought to think about. Are there areas of your town which are not served, which could be served? Some communities have moved into multifamily waste. Other communities have moved into commercial waste. But that is the place in which it would occur. You would determine to change the boundaries or the type of waste that you were collecting in your Financing Member Waste System Ordinance and agree to begin sending that waste to the agency. Let me quickly just go back to the project use agreement. The agreement itself is really the fundamental consideration in the agreement is that the agency would provide a system and the members would use it and pay for it. I mentioned the the black hole take-or-pay obligation that each member provided. The project use agreement originally contemplated that the project would provide up to 3 transfer stations, a landfill, and a landscape waste facility. The agency started out with 2 transfer stations on its drawing cards. It ended up building 1. We started down the permitting process on a second and ended up, as part of the cost efficiencies, selling that permit to, I've forgotten who it was at the time. Pardon? Browning Ferris in the Rolling Meadows transfer station. And the agency received consideration for a number of years for the efforts it had undergone to get the license for that particular facility. Again, the project use agreement required a 3/4 vote of the members of the agency board of directors in order to put it in place. So any change you think that ought to be made would need to be made as a consequence of an agreement by the member and an agreement by this board by a 3/4 vote. I'm not going to spend any time on this. You're probably most familiar with this in the sense that this is the how the rates and charges are paid. Those mechanics are all set out in the project use agreement. A couple of important points. The project use agreement, while it supports the debt, exists independent of the debt. And when the debt goes away in 2015, assuming that it does, as it's scheduled to do, the project use agreement continues. The project use agreement is not simply for the benefit of the bond market. The project use agreement is an agreement among all of the members that they have agreed to operate collectively until 2032. So SWANCC is obligated to continue to dispose of members' waste, and the members are obligated to continue to send the waste to SWANCC until, 2031, even though the debt is retired in 2015. The only exception to that rule is if this board agrees to terminate the project use agreement as to everyone or a member by a vote of 60% of the directors. There's been a fair amount of talk over the years about withdrawal of members, and so I've got a little bit here which hopefully will put it in context. In order for a member to withdraw, there are a number of documents that govern. The first is the agency agreement. The second is the project use agreement. The third is the GRUT contract. And the fourth are the bond documents. The reason everyone's been talking about 2015 is that the GRUT contract ends in 2015 and the bonds should be retired in 2015. That leaves, however, the 2 other documents, the agency agreement and the project use agreement. The agency agreement permits a member to withdraw on 180 days' notice, but its project use agreement obligations remain. SWANCC may recover any direct costs incurred by the agency caused by the withdrawal. I'll ignore the last 2 about the bond and the GRUT contract, assuming that they've been terminated or ended in some fashion. So, importantly, and to emphasize, each member continues to be obligated to send its waste to the agency, and the agency is obligated to continue to provide for the disposition of that waste until December 31st, 2031, unless that obligation is terminated by this body. I'll skip that slide because I've basically gone through it already. Separate concept from withdrawal of a member. As I indicated, the agency is a separate legal entity. It exists until it's dissolved. The law provides for its dissolution in two circumstances. One is if everybody but two withdraw, the agency is rolled up. Or secondly, 60% of the members, not the board of directors, 60% of the members determine to dissolve the agency. If there is a dissolution, the agency's liabilities are first satisfied, and then its remaining assets are distributed among the members who were members within a year prior to dissolution. So that if someone withdrew in 2 years and the agency continued another 5, not only would that member lose its voting rights during that period of time, they would lose any right that they had to a share of the assets after the liabilities of the agency had been paid if the agency were to withdraw, were to dissolve. That's the summary of the legal constraints within which the agency operations. And I'm just going to offer a few things that occurred to me that you might want to think about as you go through this planning process. First, is there still economic value to consolidating the waste of 23 municipalities or more? And if so, how can that be leveraged? Right now, you're only providing services within a narrow range of the authorized possibilities. What market demand exists for additional services? Is it a proper role for SWANCC or its members to get into that particular market? What environmental challenges do you think should be responded to that perhaps others are not responding to in the world of waste disposal? And as you're thinking about those things, what's the relative role of government versus the private sector? The Glenview Transfer Station, the second point, the Glenview Transfer Station has excess capacity. What should be done about that? How can one increase throughput to that facility, reducing the per ton cost to the members? Is it appropriate to admit new members? If the obstacles are too great, can additional customers, including municipal customers, be persuaded to come to the transfer station? What capital costs is the agency facing over the next 5 to 10 years, and how should those be funded? Does the agency want to undertake a new capital project of some kind? If you were to do that, you probably have to enter into a new agreement among the members that would permit you to finance that. The project use agreement has a limited focus for the transfer stations and the municipal waste disposal system. And because of the passage of time, the dollar limits that were imposed in that agreement probably make almost anything impossible to do under that agreement in terms of additional capital raising, with the exception of bonds to repair the existing transfer station. And what operating and capital reserves are appropriate? The transfer station is 15 years old, more or less. It has a longer useful life. What are the likely costs that the agency and its members are going to have to incur to keep that functioning in the top shape it has been? How do you raise those funds? As I mentioned, you do have an operating reserve. Is that sized appropriately? So those are some of the things that occurred to me. There are lots of other questions, and I'm certain that there will be a lively discussion as you get into this process going forward. I'd be delighted to, I don't know how much more time, George, you want to spend, but I'd be delighted to respond to questions and